Questa sezione del festival.
Good afternoon. This session of our festival is about building African cities. That is the title of this conference. And I have here with me Professor Vernon Henderson, who investigates this topic. I think that today, knowing how African cities are perhaps helps us in knowing better the situation of Africa at large. And this also helps shedding light on things and comparing and contrasting our own situation with the situation of Africa in order to tackle the topic better. Last year, based on a number of studies, the urban population of the African continent exceeded the rural population. And this means that knowing African cities is helpful in order to know better or know more about growth in Africa. African cities now are the part of Africa that is worth exploring, and it is what we should explore, as was the case with the great explorations of the territory once upon a time. Oftentimes, African cities are encircled by a belt of slums which almost have a life of their own. They are difficult to visit, they are difficult to get to know, and that goes also for journalists and for missionaries, because they have their own life, they have their own dynamics. They are almost a city within the city. And yet, these sectors, these parts of the huge cities, I think of Lagos and I think of Kinshasa, are very hard to govern in terms of number of inhabitants, also in terms of the way by which they developed. Professor Vernon Henderson is here to tell us more about this topic. So without further ado, I give him the floor, and then we will open the floor to questions and comments.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at a festival of economics. That sounds strange to economists, mixing those two terms, but it seems like it's a really enjoyable event and very stimulating. I'm going to talk about, my colleague this morning, Tony Venables from Oxford, talked about a framework for a project that we're doing that involves global cities but also African cities. And I'm going to take a small part of that, which is the subject of building cities, and talk about a paper that we're writing on that and some of the things that are in that paper. But to do so, I'm going to talk first more generally about some of the issues, and then I'm going to talk quite specifically. Yeah. Look at this. Can we shut this off? Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. I'm going to then talk about Nairobi in some detail. I haven't lived in Nairobi. Some of my two co-authors know Nairobi somewhat better, but I know Nairobi from the air, and I've certainly been there. So if some of you are from Nairobi, or by any chance, you'll know more than I do about what's on the ground, but we'll get a pretty good view of it here. Okay, so the idea here is that in developing countries, about 2/3 of the nation's capital, the private capital, produced capital, is actually buildings. And the volume of building space, literally cubic meters of building space, is a measure of that capital. So then apart from that, you have an investment in public infrastructure, and the main form of that is roads and highways. Together, these comprise a large part, the majority, in fact, the vast majority of a nation's capital stock. There's still machines, but we can also identify industrial buildings to some extent. So most of this capital is in cities, and it's disproportionately in bigger cities. So if you think of African cities, they're growing very fast, especially the bigger cities, the primate cities. They're growing at about 4% a year in population. And to do that, we have to house them, build roads, and so on. That involves a rapid deployment of capital through these cities according to investment flows. So your city's changing very rapidly, and we'll see that for the case of Nairobi. So we don't know much about this process, how well it works. Is it making these cities more efficient? So we can think of, this issue, do you build higher or denser in a city as it grows, like a New York, or do you sprawl out like a Los Angeles or an Atlanta, which is a city that was on the slide this morning? So we don't simply know very much about this. So why do we care? Well, there's some basic kind of planning issues. If you have this private capital stock, this housing going out, you have to match it with roads and utilities. The cost of doing that is going to be related to the degree of sprawl, so that if you have sort of disconnected, leapfrog development, sprawling development, you have to build your roads further out, you have to spread your utilities. That's a greater cost. It is also a function of regularity. If the city's laid out regularly, it's easy to provide this. If it's laid out irregularly, it's not. In fact, there's a developing literature on that, comparing what's called meets and bounds systems of land use and planning with rectangular systems, where meets and bounds is kind of ad hoc and rectangular is pre-surveyed and all laid out. This capital stock is your property tax base of cities. But one of the key questions right now is how much of this capital stock that we're putting in is subject in particular to climate change. So we have cities that are investing huge amounts in roads and buildings that could well be underwater in years. I mean, that's an issue, right? Why is that happening? Why is that being committed? And is it people don't think there's going to be climate change, or they're ignoring it? And then the next question is this deployment of this resource, this capital, somewhat efficient? So let's talk about that. So in developed country cities, we have a framework in our mind of this sort of downtown area that's highly commercial, business services, financial services packed into the downtown, other professional services. And then, it's not in American cities, but other cities in the developed world, you have high-income residents, and then medium, kind of low income. And then on the outskirts, on transport corridors, you have manufacturing. So regularity of okay, so, there we go, okay. It facilitates information exchange. When we look at African cities, they look very different. They have a hodgepodge of land uses. You have slums bordering on high-class commercial development. They're irregularly laid out, and we have a huge portion of the African population in slums. I'm going to get an adjustment here. You want me to speak into both? It's better this one, but okay. So how slums play into this? how slums play into this is critical. These are tracts of land under these are and then it will cut in and out, I guess. These are tracts of These are tracts of land under poor institutional regimes.
Sorry for this. Si, prova.
All right, that's better. Okay. These are tracts of land under poor institutional regimes. It means that particularly when we have plots of land near the city center, and see this in a few moments, that this process of trying within cities to allocate land to what's called the highest and best use in sort of the jargon is inhibited because it's very difficult under those institutions to do the transformation that you would like, and there are potentially significant welfare losses from that. So I'm going to do two images here. Can't tell how well you can see them. So this is Toronto. This is the lake on which Toronto sits. This is the downtown area. And I think you can see that it's fairly well regularly laid out. You can see the kind of streets going this way. You can see this high building development right in the center with these high buildings clustered together. And then as you move away from that, the heights sort of decline. So it's regularly laid out. It has this intense, continuous development at the center. This is Nairobi, and it's complicated. There's this sort of line running here. This part is the presidential palace and grounds and stuff, so we're going to ignore that. This is really the downtown that we're looking at. And if you look at it, it doesn't, first of all, it's kind of blurry, but that's not the image per se. It's the fact that it isn't organized in the same regular fashion. So the roads kind of are not laid out on a grid. The tall buildings, there are tall buildings there, but they're kind of isolated, and then you got another tall building, and then one over here, so it's very hard to pick out. It's much more a hodgepodge. If we go here, so this is a shot in Nairobi. There's a slum called Kibera here that we're going to talk about today. Kibera really starts in this corner, and then it runs 1,000 acres this way, so that's off the slide. You'll see Kibera again later. This is the edge of Kibera. These white buildings are slums, reflecting from the satellite and the angle at which this is taken. They're very dense, settlement, small shacks, not much room between them, little pathways, and so on. Bordering on it, because Kibera, this part of Kibera in particular, is quite near the downtown, are these formal sector development with tall buildings, the cars here parked. Over here is more formal sector. This area up here was a slum, and this part in here was all part of the slum. But because of the intense pressure from the market, at least at this little edge of Kibera, not in the rest of Kibera, they've been able to do some conversion. So these buildings here are under construction, and they're going to be tall buildings. The area here is going to be built. This is 2013. And then this is a slide from 2015 with now this construction complete. Notice the slums are still there. Now they're not white. That's just the way it's the angle of the sun that day and the way it's hitting them. So it's kind of harder to see them now because they're not so lit up like that on the rooftops, but they're actually all still there. So there are kind of two views on existing slums near the downtown. The first view, and it's probably in some sense the most common in the development studies world, is that these slums are places where we need to upgrade, which in some sense is correct, but there's a problem here. So what does upgrading mean? It means improve the rights of tenants, if these are tenants, or if these are units that are in principle owned by the occupant, improve. Secondly, it means trying to regularize the slum, go into it, try to widen those footpaths to some extent. So trying to convert some of the footpaths to viable roads, since there aren't many real roads through slums. Try to provide better utilities, better public services. The problem with slum upgrading is locks valuable land, especially for slums near the center, into this low rent usage with low heights. And it's definitely not what happened in the developed world. We'll see that in a moment. The other view is kind of a demolish, rebuild. Not slums at the edge, but slums near the downtown. Tear these down, relocate the residents, and rebuild what is going to be to a much higher height. So, for now, okay, I think it's back, yeah. For Nairobi, as we'll see, that a lot of the here we go, okay. Sorry. They're either movable or they're not particularly durable, so it's not necessarily a big loss of physical capital. And it's the route, in some sense, followed by China. So China, over the last 20 years, has torn down basically its entire cities. It's retained some traditional neighborhoods, but most of the cities have been torn down. All the Maoist housing is gone, almost, and completely rebuilt the cities, restructured them, moved people out to the outskirts, took over the factories that were in the downtown and relocated them. It is kind of the model for Addis Ababa that's going on right now, and Tony talked a little bit about that this morning. The downtown of Addis is slums in rent-controlled units that the government owns, and the government isn't trying to induce people at this stage, at least, to move out, to kind of hollow out the center so they can take that land and develop it into commercial use. That does have a cost, and that is there's a cost of relocation, but of course the bigger cost is potentially the loss of social networks, right? You have these slums, they have social networks, and when you relocate people, you typically don't, it might be a good idea to do so, but relocate them together so they lose their neighbors, everything gets reconfigured and shaken up. So these are slums in London. From a while ago, a slower process in London. But these are in Kensington and this in Shoreditch, both in central London. These 1865 and the shot from 1890 in Shoreditch is just before this area was torn down. And these kind of one-story, two-story buildings that existed, they're better construction than in Nairobi, but existed, they're all gone. I mean, We completely redeveloped London. All that low-income tenement housing, this kind of lower height housing, it's all gone. Okay, so that's some background. I'm going to talk about the formal, informal sector or slum sector. I'm going to talk about institutions. And then I'm going to talk about data on Nairobi. I'm going to talk a little bit about it now, I think. What we have for Nairobi is two time periods, 2003, 2004, and 2015. We have data that tells us the building footprints, the outline of every building in the city and where it is. And in 2015, we have that again with the height from LiDAR data, which is like taken from an airplane with, it's like ground penetrating radar that measures the height extremely accurately. The data for 2015 we got from a commercial firm that actually sells the product. So it's expensive to do this. So what they do is they get aerial photos, they outline the buildings electronically, create what we call building polygons, and then they have to have the LiDAR data, which is very expensive to have also, and then they have to do kind of 3D modeling of this. So this firm is a commercial firm. It does it, and the reason it does it is that there are clients in the city who want this information. The city government to start with, because it wants to know where its buildings are. The utility companies also want this information because they want to know, where utilities are going to have to go, and potentially where sewer lines ought to go, and so on. We now discovered that looking into the future, there's a potential to get this data for the whole planet and to map the whole planet today and going forward, map it from 10 years ago. So there are U.S. satellites that, probably 7 or 8 of them, that circle the globe, taking very high resolution images. They cover some part of the globe every day, every part of the globe every day, at least one of those satellites. You can put that together. For each city, then, you have potentially thousands of images. Then there's a technology to take those images, taken at different angles and so on, from that to get building height. So you can actually, using these Air Force and other satellites, you can actually map the planet particularly. It's going to cost a lot of money to do it, but there's a commercial race now to do this. It's called digital elevation modeling. So hopefully in a couple of years I might be able to come back and say, here's the planet, right? And here's what's happened on the planet over the last 10 years. And then I'm going to end up talking about slums and the potential benefits of converting slums to a different use near the city center and talk about why that hasn't happened. Okay, slums. What is a slum, right? So we have 2 maps of slums that were done by different professional teams. So there was a team from Columbia University working with the Japanese and working with international agencies that looked at and mapped Nairobi using, they were on the ground, they were using high-resolution satellite data, and they mapped what they thought were the slums in Nairobi in 2004. A different team did that in 2011. This is people looking at images, sending people on the ground to the neighborhoods. What is a slum? It's, housing that's small, low height, laid out in an irregular fashion, not well serviced. The government in Nairobi calls it an unplanned settlements, this type of thing. But of course, how one group defines it and how another group defines it is not exactly the same. That we discovered is building materials. So in Nairobi slums, the majority, 56% of them, are made with corrugated iron sheets. So this is kind of, I don't know what the right term is, like a mechano set that you can screw together and then unscrew it and rearrange it and screw it together again and reconfigure it. Another about 20% are made of mud or mud and wood. But once you go to the formal sector, it's made of permanent material. So it's made of stone and brick and block. So you might think of this in some sense as slums really being there being two technologies. One is a slum technology where you can have low-cost housing built at a low height. It's very land intensive. It's spread out on the land. Cheap materials that can potentially even be reassembled. Somewhat less risk of expropriation since you can take the thing down, put it on your back if it's corrugated iron sheets, so to speak, and take it away. If it's mud, it's got a pretty high rate of depreciation anyways. But you can't build high. That's the problem. And quality of the space is probably not very good. So in thinking about that, we have a classic urban model that Tony talked about a bit this morning. In that, access to the city center is critical. And there's a huge premium on that. As you move away from the center, land prices decline really radically. We'll look at some numbers on that. So where are you going to build slums? Well, they're land intensive. So you're going to build them where land is cheap, and that's going to be on the city edge. So, you start off with these very high rents at the city center. They decline as you move out, and then they kind of peter out into agriculture, looking at the price of land in agriculture. So essentially, slums are going to form on city edges, and we'll see in Nairobi that's where new slums tend to be going. If you have a growing city and rising land prices over time, especially near the center, absent costs of formalization or conversion from informal to formal settlement that I'm going to talk about, over time you would be redeveloping these slums, tearing them down and putting in formal sector housing, and rather than upgrading them. So we'll come back and talk about that. The problem with this in a city like Nairobi is the problems of land rights and how land rights are defined. So in Africa, a lot of the land originally was under communal rights. It was allocated by chiefs. That works pretty well in a rural setting, but it doesn't work well in an urban setting because then the chiefs have no authority, and you're no longer in a village where everybody knows everybody for generations going back. So in cities in Africa, in British Africa in particular, which is where Nairobi is. So Nairobi is in Kenya. Kenya was a British colony. Nairobi is a colonial city. It was, the British were going to put a railway through, which they did, from the coast to Lake Victoria, which is in the interior. And they were doing the surveying, and they came up over the first row of mountains, and this is a nice place. It's sort of more temperate climate, very pretty, and that became where they put Nairobi, the capital. So, but when they did this, the British had what's called a dual mandate. So they had their part of the city where there might be private property, and it would be more planned and laid out. And then they had what was in those days called the native section, and that was just left for self-governance in some sense. So they didn't come in and try and impose any regime or any planning or anything like that. It's part of the reason when we look at a picture of Nairobi, it looks so disorganized, because you are mixing all these different sort of land systems together. So it's difficult enough to convert from sort of communal use into something that is private property, and that becomes a lengthy legal process that some people try to pursue. The other problem is we're going to see that in many cases the government has stepped in and seized lands, and that becomes even worse problem. So there are high costs to trying to take these slums and put them into some other use. In the formal sector, residential and commercial, we think it's sort of fairly cheap to build high, but it's what we call putty clay in economics. You build it, you want to change it, you got to tear it down, bring in the wrecking ball, and start all over again. So it's a long-term commitment. Tony mentioned this morning. There's a role of expectations here. These are irreversible decisions. So if you think a city isn't going to grow very fast, it's going to grow slowly, if that's kind of the wisdom in the market, then builders are going to build lower buildings because they don't expect this rise in prices, and they're going to end up with a stunted city. The second aspect is that, of course, as a city grows and land prices escalate, at some point you're going to redevelop existing buildings that, if given the price of land, the buildings are too low, land is too valuable, and you want to build even higher and use more capital. And so you're going to demolish and reconstruct. And depending how fast land prices are rising, that process may take 100 years, it may take 50 years, or potentially even less. Okay, so for Nairobi, as I said, we have these two sets of footprints. We're going to overlay them at some point here, briefly at least, and we're going to talk about which buildings were unchanged, or how much was unchanged, how much was redeveloped. So where there was a building before, now there's a building with a different footprint, usually a bigger building. There's going to be demolition, in this case, meaning old buildings that were torn down where it's a transition, where there's yet to a new building to appear. So that's going to be very modest. And then there's infill, which are new buildings where there wasn't a building in 2004. We get volume by simply multiplying the footprint size by the height. We're going to do this for two types of usage, formal sector and slums. And I already said we have two different definitions of slums, and we're going to use them both. We have some other data. There's a lot of data on Nairobi now. Once you go there and you invest in it on the residential sector, from a survey on rents that are paid and on heights in the slums and in the non-slum areas. And we've scraped land price data from the web to get a sense of land prices in Nairobi. So here's some maps of Nairobi. This is kind of what we call the city boundary in 2004. It's where some smooth measure of cover kind of gets very low and you're really into agricultural areas. Nairobi runs east-west quite a ways. It's bounded on the north and south by a forest preserve, so you can't really expand this way. You can only go this way. This is the center of Nairobi. The circle here is the area in 2004 around the center in which there were no slums. These here are the slums that were mapped by this 2004 team, based actually on images from 2003. So there are these blue areas. This slum here is Kibera, that we're going to talk about somewhat extensively. What else can I say? Okay, then we go and repeat this for 2015. This is kind of this former boundary here. Now with this sort of smooth-built surface boundary, the city has expanded. The area around the center where there are absolutely no slums has expanded, so somehow land has gotten so valuable there that they've resolved the institutional problems. Kibera is still there. And we see this expansion of slums to the extent this is real and not just slums that weren't defined in 2004, is occurring kind of out here at the city edges where we think it ought to be. But then we still have these traditional slums here near the downtown. So one of the issues I'm going to talk about, and I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but we have slums and we have non-slums. Slums are these very carefully bounded areas that are just really intense housing and some business activity, not much else. The formal sector is a residual. It's everything else. So yes, it's commercial buildings, it's and residential buildings, but so all the roads. Now some of those are side roads and streets, side streets that service the formal sector housing and commercial, so that's really part of that. But some of it is, highways or 4-lane streets that serve the whole population, public parks, garbage dumps, government buildings, utilities, all kinds of stuff that isn't part of the private sector. So that all falls in the formal sector, which is a complication for us, plus any land that's just undeveloped for some reason of conflict over property rights or something else. Nobody will touch it. This is a 3D map of Nairobi in 2015. This is a bunch of grid squares here, 150 meters by 150 meters, and it measures the average height in that grid square of the built surface, right? So how high on average are buildings? This is the downtown within 2 kilometers. This is the formal sector in blue, the slums in orange. So you see this, I think you can see, this very high concentration here of tall buildings near the center. There's some on the outskirts too. The slums, this is Kibera, is at a low height, pretty uniformly. These slums here, to some degree these, but up here we have some tall buildings in the slums, and you look at the images and that's simply misclassification. Those are clearly not slum areas. So whatever this team was doing in 2011, they messed up, at least in this part of the city, in defining slums. There's some blank areas in here. There's an airport, President's Palace, golf course. I'm not sure what else I'm missing. Just stuff that either we can't map. The President's Palace is not routinely mapped, maybe for security reasons. And they're not going to assess property taxes on it. Okay. So I'm going to run through some slides here that show gradients. So this is a tool that urban economists use. It's kind of taking the city, thinking of it as rings, and as you move out from the center, what happens? So in any ring, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers, there's going to be enormous heterogeneity, as we can tell from this, previous map. But on average, there's this pretty strong tendency. So the first thing that we talked about already was that these are land prices. This is the price per square meter of vacant land. And it starts at the center here. This is distance to the center, and it declines pretty rapidly. This is the price in logs. There's about a 5-fold differential here between the city center and 10 kilometers out. But the city goes 20 kilometers out, there's going to be an even greater decline. So this is a 5 times differential in the price. And overall, relative to the rural sector, it might be 10 or 15 or more. Corresponding to that, we have these height gradients. So this is average height of buildings at each distance in the formal sector in blue. So this is in meters. So on average here, it's like 22 meters near the center, and then it drops to down here to 8 meters, which is somewhere between a 1- and 2-story building. And then we have the slums, and the slums are flat throughout. That's the technology, right? They're built with stuff that you can't use to build high. If anything, there's an actual modest increase in this. And this is the height, same picture, except it's in floors from the survey data on residential houses in the slum and in the formal sector. And again, you have the same pattern. a decline in height in the formal sector and a flat height in the slums. The second feature of this, and it's kind of revealed in this with these what's called confidence intervals, is that in the slums, height is really uniform. There's not much variation. So if I looked at rather than the mean height here, I looked at the 25th versus the 70th percentile, or the 10th versus the 90th, there'd be very little difference. In the formal sector, there's going to be huge variation in height near the city center. It's going to diminish, but even out here, there's going to be big variation in height depending on what the use of that building is and when it was constructed. So this is in intensity of use. And I'm going to try and describe this to you because I want to talk about volume and changes in volume over time. So this is literally cubic meters of built space in thousands on this axis here. So we're talking, 160,000, 180,000 cubic meters of space for this area on the ground, which is 150 meters by 150 meters. So this is the volume that's generated in there. The ground includes the building footprint, includes roads, all that kind of stuff. And you can see this intense volume in the formal sector declines as we move away, as height did from the center, and then kind of bounces along. And this is volume in the slum areas. And actually, it's quite close, so that the slums don't have any height, but they have this intense ground coverage. So 45 to 80% of the land is actually covered with buildings, or in the formal sector it would be much less than that. So you kind of have this trade-off. The slums give a lot of what's going to be low-quality housing, very tightly bunched together, but it has no height. In the formal sector, buildings are spread out, but they're much higher. There does seem to be a gap in here, and there's some issue here about, of course, what's the formal sector. We've taken out big roads and some of the bigger parks and a garbage dump. This is the misclassification that you saw in that 3D slide, coming in there suggesting a volume, but it's really coming from the formal sector and just misclassified as slums. So that leads into something about the dynamics that I'm going to do a couple of slides on. So this is taking these images from 2003, 4, 2015, and basically overlaying them and defining buildings as either being unchanged, the same building, being infill, where there was no building before, or being redevelopment, where you redeveloped a building. And this is the heights of each of these categories. So the black is what you basically saw before. It's unchanged buildings, this sharp decline from the city center. This is infill buildings. They're all built at a low height in the formal sector, even near the city center. So why is that? I'll also note that in terms of redeveloped buildings, which are the blue, which I think you see this line here, that near the center, redeveloped buildings are actually shorter than existing buildings, which seems odd because I've been talking about how you're going to build higher. But then once you get beyond 1.5 kilometers out here, there's a substantial difference in height between the new buildings, which are built high relative to the unchanged. So what's going on near the center? The center is committed. 25% of it is roads that haven't changed. They're government buildings. They're historical buildings. They're high-rise things that were built in the 80s that aren't ready to come down, or in the 90s. So it's kind of committed. If you want to do infill and intensify that cover in the center, you're using things like parking lots. Right? Little parking lots that weren't developed in 2004 kind of now disappeared, and they have some small building in there. And it can't be a tall building, because to have a tall building you need to have a big piece of land, because you need to have a big base. It's the same thing with the redevelop near the center, that, you know, you've got this existing building, you tear it down, you can enlarge its footprint a little bit, encroach on the neighbors, maybe tear something else down, but it's, again, very hard to assemble a big plot to rebuild to a higher height. Okay, so final thing before I get into slums, per se, this is the volume change in the formal sector, just to give you a sense. I haven't shown 9 and 10 kilometers out, which I had before. That's because the volume changes are 100%, 200%. And if I showed those, I wouldn't be able to show the rest of this. So this is demolition. It kind of bubbles along. It's land in transition. This is infill, which is some substantial here, but then gets much more substantial as you move away from the city center. The blue, again, is percentage increase in initial volume. That's due to redevelopment, and the black is the total. So first of all, if you look at the black, say go out to 5 kilometers, that's about a 55% increase in volume, building volume, in just 10 years. So there's a lot of change going on here. When you get near the city center, a lot of that is from redevelopment. 35% increase in volume just by taking old buildings, tearing them down, and somewhat higher. Okay, so these cities are in motion. They're being reconstructed, and Nairobi's a good example of this. Okay, slums. Back to this question, what should we do with slums near the city center? So the basic theme here is that they're built low, and they're using a technology that's appropriate when land prices are low, but not when they're high. And secondly, they're low quality in the sense that the space itself is low quality, the materials, the space that you're living in, the way it's serviced, bathrooms, kitchens, and so on that you have. And then once you step outside, you don't have good streets that you can use. It's very crowded. Your neighbors live on top of you, so to speak. Very little open space. Things that people value as amenities. So rents in slums are really low because, not just because people's income are low, and in fact there's a pretty close overlap in the income distribution between slum and non-slum. I mean, there's a difference, but a large overlap. So there's going to be this rent differential that we'll talk about, just reflecting quality. So in the data that we saw already, slums near the center are, right next to the center, are gone within 2 kilometers. But when we look 3 to 5 kilometers out, there's still a lot of slums, apart from the growing slums on the city edge. The remaining slums near the city center have high costs to convert. They have high, what we call, formalization costs. And we think that's associated with government ownership. So this bottom graph here is just distance to the center, and we have some data in 2011 who owns the land in these slums. These are ones near the city center are 100% government owned. There's some decline in that. And then this is private sector ownership, the fraction that's owned in the private sector, essentially zero near the center. And then as you get to those slums near the edge, they're classified as being privately owned, which maybe for the future looks good. But I'm going to talk about these government slums. So in Nairobi, the residents of slums are renters. So that's not the case worldwide. In some countries, in slums, people are in some sense have some claim to the land, and they're living on a small plot. They don't have well-defined land rights, but they have what we call use rights, and there's no other real claimant, so they're not paying rents to somebody. But in Nairobi, these are pretty much everybody's a renter. It's almost 100%. And they don't have any tenancy agreement. There's been a lot written about slumlands in Nairobi. Who runs these so-called government slums? Well, there's landlords, chiefs, bureaucrats, gangs, as this quote here says. There was a major government report done about 10 to 15 years ago, or 15 years ago, trying to look at the land allocation process in these slums, subject to corruption, outright plunder, the kind of quotes that appear in the report, which for a government report is pretty strong. So on these government lands where the slums are near the center, there are slumlords. These are people operating housing units. They, according to studies done, make enormous profits, a 60-80% rate of return. I think there's some issue about whether those rates of return include bribes they have to pay, so to be able to operate in essence illegally or quasi-legally, they do have to pay bribes to certain other parts of the government. But they have no claim to the land there. They don't own it. If the land were to be redeveloped by the government, they would have no claim to it and the value that it would generate. So they don't want the land converted because they're operating here as slumlords and they're making a lot of money. That makes conversion a political problem, and I'm going to talk more about that. Now, you could try and buy these people out, and I'll bring that up again. So, Kibera. Kibera is that 1,000 acres that we saw. Kibera was given to the Nubians by the British in 1912. They were part of the King's Rifles, I think it was called. And this was their reward for loyal service to the British and the colonial enterprise. So they were given this land on a grant, but the British did not actually give them title. So the Nubians, whatever the remnants of this army were, came in and they occupied part of this 1,000 acres and built their houses on it and so on. The rest gradually over time became occupied by different people, not legally, in a process that's, I guess, very ill-defined in some sense, some amount of corruption, illegal claims, people claiming they owned the land when, of course, they didn't. After independence in Kenya, the government revoked the claim of the Nubians to all the Kibera lands, whether they lived on them or not, took over ownership of this land, but I would say not responsibility. The slumlords in Kibera live outside the slum, and they are mostly actually politicians. So we have this basic problem that you have powerful people in the government who own the slum buildings and are opposed to any kind of conversion because, of course, they would lose this valuable business operation that they have if the land was converted. So we thought about that, and we did the kind of what we thought would be an interesting calculation. We looked at the difference here in rents per square meter of space in the formal sector versus in the slums. The formal sector follows that land price gradient that you saw, high prices near the center, low prices further out because access to the center is highly valued. In the slums, the gradient is either flat or perhaps even increasing. That may reflect the quality of the slums, of the government slums near the center versus the private slums further out. It may reflect the fact that some of the residents who live in these slums in, say, Kibera are actually wanting to commute out towards the city edge rather than in towards the city center. We don't know. But there's this basic difference in price per square meter of floor space, reflecting, what people are willing to pay. There's this difference in volume here. It looks like the other graph I showed you, but we've adjusted it a bit. We've tried to kind of repredict slums to remove some of the misclassification. So there's a bigger gap between the volume offered in the formal sector and in slums. So what we did is the following. We took the area of slums between 1 and 5 kilometers out. We know the area of that. We know the difference in the volume intensity of in the slums versus the formal sector, with the formal sector generally being somewhat higher. And we know the difference in the rents. So you go through a bunch of calculations. You take the volume, you convert it to price per square meter of floor space, which is what the rents are, and we sum up the gains to formalization. As a back-of-the-envelope calculation, what would you gain if you converted these slums to formal sector usage? Put it in present value terms as though this were going to be a permanent change from one regime to another, discounted at 4%. Put it in US $2015. The revenue gain is somewhere, depending on what you assume, let's say around $2 billion, maybe a little more. So it's a substantial revenue gain. Now, I haven't talked about the cost side, so you have to reconstruct all that formal sector volume. That's going to be costly. That's laid out here. But if you think of land values being about 35% of revenue, it gives you some sense of how much land values would increase. So there's a lot of money there, potentially, that should be to buy out these slum lords, and maybe even some left over to help the tenants relocate. So what I've talked to you about here at the end is this notion of cities redeveloping, a dynamic process, especially for fast-growing cities where income is growing fast. You have, if the city is evolving, you have the kind of informal slum areas at the edge, as we saw where they were growing in the original maps, because they're low cost and they're using land very intensively. We have some process of time-to-time conversion of slums to formal sector as the city overruns them in essence. And we have redevelopment of the formal sector going on as the city grows, building to higher and higher heights. Slums, in some sense, those near the city center under this sort of corrupt land practices and inability really to convert to private usage, are a misallocation. They're representing very valuable land that you would have a better and higher use, and as we saw in European cities. And there's a role of history here and a combination of poor land rights and corruption that inhibits that process. So let me stop there.
Bene, grazie al professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Vernon Henderson. I must say that now we know much more about slums than we did before. While listening to Professor Henderson, I thought back of the slums and my knowledge of slums, and if you know what it is to live in a slum, you know how chaotic it can be, and you know that even tiny plots are used to the maximum. The people use every corner of space in a slum. So it seems difficult to think in terms of allocating land there because everything is so chaotic. So a question that comes to my mind is, since we have this political interference and we have this exploitation on the part of politicians basically who own, if we can say so, the area and manage it. So if it is so, what does that translate into? And you also said that slums are communities. That was very interesting. So if it is so, do these communities have a negotiating power? Can they decide something? So this is something that I would kindly ask you to comment on. But in the meantime, what do you think about it? I would kindly ask the audience if there are questions from the audience too. So I open the floor to possible questions from people here, and then I will kindly ask you to give me a comment on what I have just said. Are there questions?
Buongiorno.
Good afternoon. You mentioned in your contribution climate change, and you talked about social networks, the communities that exist and live in the slums. So my question is, would you please go back to these two topics, because you mentioned these things, but then you did not comment extensively upon them, and I would like to know more about that. So while people here think about possible additional questions, I would like to give you back the floor, Professor, because we asked basically two similar questions, and I think you can comment on them together.
Okay. Hopefully this will work. The climate change is somewhat easier in the sense that people have, you can map the world, you can map what would go underwater if the polar ice caps melted faster than were originally projected to melt, which is what is happening, and what types of climate change that brings on. So I have two family members who are geologists who do climate. So I hear a lot about climate change. So there are academics out there trying to do these exercises. It's clear that somewhere in the middle of what the forecasts are, there would be a lot that would go underwater, and there are, I'll give you an example, in the United States, New Orleans, right? New Orleans was flooded, right? The levees broke, and it was flooded, and they've now rebuilt the city, and fine. I mean, that was a city. It meant something to the people there. It was perhaps an important thing to do. But with climate change, trying to deal with those levees and sustain New Orleans is going to be really hard. And that's in a developed country. You have the Netherlands, which has defined itself as resisting the sea, whatever it is, 35% of the Netherlands, I've forgotten the number, but about that would be underwater without the barriers. But developing countries don't have the money or the technology to do that, and it's not clear that's money that would be well spent. I mean, for the Netherlands, it's an issue of existence, right? So you do this so you can exist. If you take Ho Chi Minh City and the coast of Vietnam, there's been enormous investments in the highway system along the coast, and of course in Ho Chi Minh City, and that potentially is all going to be underwater. Large parts of Ho Chi Minh City are going to be underwater, and certainly that highway system at segments along the coast will be completely destroyed. So should they have built the highway further in and away from that? Governments are not thinking carefully about those decisions. So if we ever get this universal map of volume, I'll be able to tell you under various scenarios how much of the world's building space will be underwater in 50 years or 75 years from now, whatever scenario you want. On the slums and the social networks and the costs, it's really tough, right? So if I give this talk to, say, a policy audience at the World Bank, I'll get sometimes really negative reactions, because what I'm saying is that slums are this low-cost technology. They're appropriate at the city edge and are probably appropriate at some low-income level. But as incomes rise, and we're not going to have slums anymore, and certainly we're not going to have slums at the city center on really valuable land that has, in some sense, a much better use. There is an implication, right, that you have neighborhood change, and that happens in all cities to all neighborhoods. In some sense, there are neighborhoods that decline, neighborhoods that are gentrified, people get shoved out. That has a cost. there is a social cost to that of these people relocating. It's something that is part of the process, and of course they have to deal with, and they're going to be winners and losers in that process, and it's tough. So that when I say, all right, Kibera ultimately in a proper scheme should come down. A proper scheme would be something, and there's been movements in Indian slums to try and do a better job of this, to redevelop slums, but to ensure that you have something for the residents who are left. Or if you take the case of Addis, this is a citywide program, right, to relocate people from the slums using government subsidies to put them in better quality housing, so you can hollow out that city center and use it for something that's the highest and best use. The Chinese did a similar thing. They induce people. The problem is that as you get near the end of the process and, 3/4 of your slum is located and you got a quarter left, and the quarter left don't want to leave, and then the government gets impatient and they come in and they bulldoze, and those people, and the Chinese certainly did that in some cases, and those people do lose out. But I'm thinking of a situation like Kibera, where there's a lot of land here and there's a lot of money at stake. And there is a potential here to not just buy out these politicians, and maybe you say they shouldn't be bought out, but it's a practical matter, of buying them out and of helping the residents relocate and helping them move. I don't know. I'm happy to, if you want to expand on the question, I'm happy to talk more.
Sì, io...
Well, I have always thought, when thinking of slums, of a specific case, the case of one slum area in Rwanda, the capital of Angola, Luanda, the capital of Angola. And the slum was called Rock Santero because the inhabitants of the slums made reference to a hero of a telenovelas that they could see on TV, and it was a sort of modern Robin Hood, stealing from the wealthy to give to the poor. And so that area, that slum, at least in the mind of people, was a sort of social recycling experiment, meaning that people there became, in a way, more powerful thanks to the fact of living there, and they benefited from the fact of being part of a community, of living in a city within a city. This is what actually I was hinting at when asking you the question before. Is it really so? Are these cities within cities? Do they have a bargaining power? Do they have an impact on the development of the big cities in Africa or not?
They have a bargaining power in the sense there are a lot of people, and the majority of people. And so in the political process, to the extent that they're represented, they have bargaining power. What they should be bargaining for, I guess, is the question, right? So, yes, in some slums there's a real spirit. The situation in Kibera is complicated because of the Nubians, but put that aside. But these are also not the greatest places to live. And the social conditions, there may be a spirit, but the conditions, the health conditions that your kids are exposed to, the poor quality of water and sewage, the cramming together of people is not a very healthy environment. And, we don't expect people in the developed world to live like that. And as these countries develop, people will not want to continue living like that. If you can move them en masse, you can potentially and try to It's not something you hear about, but try to retain the social network, try to retain some of the spirit. I guess that's a possibility. I don't know. I just know that in the long term, as these countries develop and they get richer, people aren't going to want to be in slum housing. They're not going to want to expose their kids to that, and they're not going to want to live like that. It's just not going to be the case.
Bene, se ci sono domande a me ne sorgo.
Actually, there are so many questions that come to my mind, but perhaps there are more questions from the audience. I apologize because I arrived late, so I was not here from the beginning, and it might be that I missed something. But my question is, in this very moment, are there attempts at developing new towns? Because I know that there are some projects of financing the building of new towns with the public money as well. And I think of some European projects. Then I don't know whether this will be translated into something practical, whether it's simply something on paper. I don't know whether there are powers there that make compounds, that is a sort of fenced areas with guards, armed guards, which is what you see also in some places in Italy right now, like where golf courses are. Are there additional questions? I thought of a parallel with Italy after the Second World War. I think of Italy in the 50s and 60s when so many public housing was constructed, social housing was built, and actually the majority of houses here were built in that period. So we did have a similar phenomenon, I think. And do you think that something similar is possible in Africa or not? Can we draw a parallel with post-war Italy?
Those are all tough questions. So, new towns, I'm thinking of two different things, right? One is the kind of gated communities that you see springing up around the world, of whether it's China or Italy or the United States, of relatively high-income people fencing themselves off from the rest of the world, living in some sense in another world. I guess that's a good way to put it. In the United States, people write about this as fear of crime, fear of exposure to minorities, the Donald Trumps of the world living in gated communities or something. So that's out there. That happens. New towns, to me, has in some sense a different connotation. It's an attempt by governments to try and direct urban growth, to say, all right, our city's too crowded, let's create some satellite cities around it, and let's do that. And that's kind of a feature of some aspects of urban planning. The record on new towns is kind of mixed. If the government guesses wrong about where people want to live, you have a, unfulfilled new town. We saw settlements in Dar es Salaam where the government had built, or there was actually some of the financed with some pension fund monies, but they were trying to build communities further from the center that were meant for civil servants, were quite nice communities, probably a little too nice. But they were far from the center in commuting time because the roads were very poor, very hard to get to, and nobody was moving to them. So in essence, they were unoccupied. So there is, and if I think in China, they have this plan for Beijing to try and extend it to the east and west because that would be environmentally better. They have a great plan by city planners. The government completely ignores it and is just building basically wherever they want. So it's a lot of conflict between in some sense, planners and architects who have a vision. In some cases that's economically realistic. In other cases, it's not. And when it is economically realistic, perhaps it's not politically realistic in the sense that the government won't provide proper services for them. It's kind of a similar comment on public housing, that we see this experiment in Addis, actually, which is to move people out of public housing, out of rent-controlled slum housing in the downtown, into buildings that they'll actually own, that they'll then want to assume responsibility for in terms of maintenance. So the record of public housing in some countries is pretty bad in the developed world, and maybe I'm thinking too much of the United States, where, as you may know, that in the 1960s, the United States built these what we call vertical slums, right? They took people out of low-income neighborhoods, particularly with black migration into northern cities, and put them in these huge high-rises that turned out to be incredibly unsafe and not very well constructed. And those are all gone now. They were all torn down because they were just not a good way to do housing. So public housing, if you're going to do it and the government's going to be involved, has to be done carefully, and you want people who really know about housing and housing markets to be running it. But is that a solution in Africa? I'm not sure. It's an income phase thing. It's, you know, the slums on the outskirts here that are on viable land for slums, and they're built of not very good building materials. It also reflects the fact that people's incomes are very low. As they rise, can we move them into better quality housing? It's a question Tony talked about this morning. Is the technology there? It probably is, but at what income level, I'm not sure. So there's certainly potentially a role for public housing, but also a lesson that it has a very checkered record around the world, perhaps because of misuse as a political animal. I'm not sure.
Provo ancora a buttare una lì.
So, if I may, I would like to ask you another question. In the mid-90s, when the time of Daniel Arap Moi, the president of Kenya, came to an end, and Kibaki was appointed, I heard that in Kibera, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but then I also had the opportunity to read some studies about it. So apparently the new president and the establishment were considering to redevelop Kibera. After hearing what you said today, I can only imagine the type of conflict that arose in those days among the political circles, if they really considered doing something of that kind. I had the opportunity to see some programs. I also had the opportunity to see some excavations where they were trying to develop the sewage system. So then I know that everything came to an end. So do you think it is possible to redevelop a slums area without transferring huge amounts of people? I do realize this is a difficult question, but...
I think the situation in Kibera is to some degree complicated by the Nubians, who have, I think, a pretty well recognized moral claim to at least the land that their descendants sit on, which is a part of Kibera, and an unwillingness so far of the government to give them property rights to these lands. I mean, they're not going to give them the 1,000 acres of Kibera, obviously, but they could give them the part that they live on. And there's talk about that going on right now. It hasn't happened. I think that these politicians, having gotten into the housing market in Kibera, make it very difficult. I think there is a process where you could, as I said, potentially buy them out find a solution so that you could redevelop Kibera. So when you talk about redevelopment, what do you mean? I mean, I'm talking about it really that you would probably take this land and convert it into formal sector housing, some high-rise housing, some commercial development. It depends what part of Kibera and how close to the city center you are. What would happen to the former residents? It's possible some of them would buy in. Their educational levels, if you look at the distribution of income of people in the formal and in the slum sector, there's a really strong overlap. It's possible that some of these folks could buy in and could afford it. Presumably a lot would not, and they would be shoved out, and hopefully there would be compensation and so on. So you could design, in principle, a comprehensive program to do this. Can you do this in the political and corruption climate of Kenya? You know, it's a challenge.
Domande?
Any more questions?
Io credo che...
Well, I believe we still have some time for maybe a final question and a final answer. Nobody's telling me that we have to close, so 10 minutes left. All right, then. If there are no more questions from the audience, I'll try and ask another question myself. Is there a lot of a difference between Kibera, for instance, and other slums in the Nairobi area? I mean, the social system that leads to the birth of such slums and that regulate the slums, is it the same everywhere, or it changes according to the slum? And does it depend on the distance from the city center? Does it depend on the ownership, if there are, of course, differences? I mean,
yeah, I think it depends on the ownership. So these so-called government-owned slums where the land rights are really confused, the government's taken them over or expropriated them, are the most complex situation. I think in the slums on the edge that are so-called private ownership, now I'm not entirely sure what that means, and we're trying to clarify that, but that's the way it's classified. Potentially there, the people who are operating in those slums and own the land have an incentive to try and make those better places to live, to regularize them, to look to the future, and potentially to start developing them to even a higher standard. It's complicated because they are the places where migrants go now, so there's an enormous inflow of people into these new slums on the edge, and an awful lot of change going on, and there is, in some sense, an absence of governance there. These are classified by the government as unplanned areas, meaning, have fun, folks, and we're not going to help you very much. So it's a complicated process, but it is very different by, I think, the type of slum, who owns it, the ones near the edge being newer and in some sense being evolving as we kind of speak, and the unwillingness of the government in some sense to, I think, to deal with the problem and to just leave this and just call it, well, these are unplanned areas. I mean, but that's where people are living, right? It's a mess. Leave it.
Ancora una velocissima.
A very, very fun question, very quick question. From a political viewpoint, these are huge numbers of people who live in the slums with a much higher intensity than, the intensity you have in downtown. Are these people all voters? I mean, how do politicians leverage on them?
Yeah, they're voters. I mean, of course they're voters. And Kenya is a democracy. I mean, it's not necessarily a wide open democracy, but it's a democracy. Kenya's is a lot of corruption. I mean, I have friends who were born there, grew up there, middle-class people. They're trying to do businesses. They're trying to, be successful. They have the education and the skills to do that. And their attitude at this point is, we're not looking for the government to help us. We just want them to get out of the way so they don't hurt us. And that's not a great state of affairs.
Bene, grazie al...
All right then, thank you very much, Mr. Professor Henderson. That was a very, very interesting conference, at least for me. For those of us who live in and work in Africa, being aware what happens in these areas where it is difficult to work and even, have access to, was definitely very valuable for me. Thank you very much.